right, let Mr. Taylor step down. All right, who is the state wanting to call as their first witness?
Dr. Tucker Johnson, Your Honor.
Okay.
Do you swear to tell the truth, so help you God?
All right.
Thank you, Your Honor. Could you please tell us your name and spell both your first and last name?
My first name is Tucker. That's spelled Tucker. My last name is Johnson. That's spelled Johnsson.
And do you practice a profession?
Clinical psychology. I'm a licensed psychologist in Tennessee.
And could you please, for the court, recount your educational experience, and then we'll get into your work experience.
Okay. My educational experience is that I obtained a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from North Carolina State University. Then I obtained a PhD in Psychology from the University of Alabama with a subspecialty of Psychology and Law. And then I completed an internship that was through the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Department of Psychiatry and at the federal prison at Butner, North Carolina, which at that time was called the Federal Correctional Institution, but it had a psychiatric hospital in it, and that was for forensic training specifically.
And how long were you at that facility?
A pre-doctoral internship is a year, but I stayed 2 more years after that at Butner. They hired me to continue for another couple of years while I was finishing my PhD research with federal inmates.
Okay. And what were your duties and responsibilities at the prison?
While I was an intern, I was trained in pretrial competency evaluations and pretrial evaluations for support for insanity. The remaining 2 years that I was there, I provided a lot of therapy to inmates, including I was one of the co-therapists for the Bureau of Prisons pilot sex offender treatment program, and that lasted a year. So that was my experience. The first year was solely forensic evaluation training. The next 2 years were therapy and treatment of inmates with a specialty in sex offender treatment.
I see that also licensed as a health service provider, is that correct?
I am.
And what does that entail?
Well, that means that in the state of Tennessee, I can provide health services as part of being a psychologist. I mean, there's some psychologists in Tennessee who are purely academicians or in some other role, but health service provider means that I can provide health services. I can do assessment and treatment in the state of Tennessee, psychological assessment and treatment.
Okay. And where do you currently practice?
I currently work in private practice. I've been in private practice since March of 2000. I perform several different activities as part of that private practice. I do forensic evaluations for the courts, both state and federal courts. I also do pre-employment psychological evaluations for first responders, police, fire, dispatchers, in 3 of the main suburbs of Memphis, and then in some several rural areas as well. And I'm also on the allied health staff at Lakeside Hospital, which is the largest psychiatric hospital in Memphis. And essentially, I evaluate and testify about individuals who are dangerous by virtue of mental illness.
All right. And is that just Shelby County, or does it include other areas of West Tennessee?
Lakeside Hospital accepts patients, including from Arkansas and Mississippi. It's not just Shelby County.
Okay. And prior to that, what was your employment before that?
Okay. So my employment directly prior to being in full-time private practice, I was 6 years with the Juvenile Court of Memphis and Shelby County. I was administrator of the Office of Clinical Services. What we did in the clinical services was solely forensic evaluations for the juvenile court judge. They were all court-ordered. Most of those evaluations are what we call juvenile transfer evaluations, but I also did competency and insanity evaluations for the higher profile cases. And I would add that the individuals that I evaluated came from very similar environments to the current defendant.
Okay. When you say current defendant, would that be Mr. Shaquille Taylor?
Yeah, that would be.
And is he the gentleman seated in the
He is.
orange jumpsuit? We'll get more about him. Again, recitation of your experience and background.
Right. Prior to that, I worked for about 6 months at West Tennessee Forensic Services, which is the forensic outpatient referral site for the Shelby County courts. It's the equivalent to Vanderbilt for Davidson County. And I would have liked to have worked there longer, but when the opening at juvenile court came up, everybody agreed, including West Tennessee Forensic Services, because there had been problems with coordinating with juvenile court in the past. Everybody wanted me to apply for that position. So before that, I worked for 6 years for the Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities for Tennessee, now known as DDA. I was the regional psychologist, and then my title changed to resource psychologist. For the first 3.5 years of those 6 years, I did primarily individual therapy with high-functioning people with intellectual disability. The last 2.5 years, I was designated as the intellectual disability specialist for 22 counties in West Tennessee. Now, I don't particularly like that title. I consider myself learning about everything as I go along, but I was the intellectual disability specialist, which meant that when West Tennessee Forensic Services got an order for an outpatient forensic pretrial evaluation for a defendant either suspected of having intellectual disability or known to have.
You might want to push the microphone just a little bit further away from it.
I'm sorry. Is this better? Okay. Is this better? Yeah. Okay. So West Tennessee Forensic Services, if someone was known to have an intellectual disability or suspected of having an intellectual disability, they at that time referred those individuals to an intellectual disability specialist. That's the title. So for 2.5 years, all I did was do pretrial forensic evaluations of individuals either known or suspected to have an intellectual disability. And I evaluated them for competence, criminal responsibility or insanity, committability, and occasionally competence to waive Miranda. Prior to that, I had several jobs where I worked supervising Navy officers, lay officers who provided substance abuse-related services to other Navy officers. I also worked for a number of years in nursing homes, so I worked specifically with elderly individuals. When I worked as a consulting psychologist in Jackson, Tennessee for 3 years, I performed Social Security disability evaluations and evaluations for special education in the schools in several counties surrounding Madison County. Before that, all of my career, the beginning of my career was in the Bureau of Prisons. So after I left Butner, after being there for 3 years, one of them being an internship, I then served as chief psychologist at 3 different federal prisons around the country, one in Montgomery, Alabama, one in Terminal Island, California. It's a terrible name, but it's in Southern California. And then I was chief psychologist at the Federal Medical Center in Rochester, Minnesota. That's a similar similar institution to Butner. It takes medical and psychiatric referrals from around the country for treatment and forensic evaluations. So I supervised all of the services, including the forensic service, and I performed forensic evaluations not every single day, but I did do forensic evaluations, and those were for pretrial, competency and committability, and then, competency and insanity, and then I also did evaluations for individuals who had been found not guilty by reason of insanity for murder, and they had been committed involuntarily in the federal system. So those people have to be reevaluated on a scheduled basis, at that time once a year, and I conducted those kinds of evaluations, deciding whether those individuals still met criteria for commitment as dangerous secondary to mental illness.
Any rough estimate of, over the years, how many discrete individuals you have examined for any of the issues that you've told us about?
You know, I don't know. For all of the individuals I've evaluated, I would say that's over 200 in terms of individuals who were known or suspected to have intellectual disability, at least 100 of those.
All right. And you referenced earlier about testifying.
Yes.
Have you testified as an expert to your opinions in the courts of this state?
Yes, I have been qualified as an expert in the Shelby County criminal courts. I, for a while, maintained a temporary license in Mississippi, so I've been qualified as an expert there, and then also qualified in federal courts, several around the country.
All right, this time I would tender Dr. Johnson as an expert in clinical psychology and would tender a copy of her curriculum vitae as an exhibit.
Okay.
And counsel has a copy.
Get that. We'll make an exhibit. Okay. All right, go ahead.
Thank you. Dr. Johnson referenced that you are currently in private practice.
I am.
Basically. And pursuant to contact with our office, were you retained by the Office of the District Attorney General for the Nashville-Davidson County to do a psychological assessment of Mr. Taylor's intellectual and adaptive functioning?
I was.
And when approximately did you become involved with this case?
Probably August, maybe, or July, when I was originally retained in 2024. I evaluated Mr. Taylor 2 different dates in September of 2024. And since that time, additional record, I mean, I reviewed some records, but additional records have been received and are incorporated into my report. And I've received some additional records even after my report was finished.
Okay, and referencing your report, do you have a copy of that which you're able to refer
Yes.
to as needed?
Yes.
And is that a 45-page document?
It is.
All right. Now, with respect to Mr. Taylor, you said you saw him on 2 occasions.
I did. I
Was-
saw him on the 12th of September and the 26th of September, 2 evaluation sessions, 14 days apart.
Now, was that virtual or in person?
It was all in person.
And where was it conducted?
At the at MCC, in the visiting room there, that's where it was conducted. The entire evaluation was conducted there in the visiting room.
Okay. Do you recall anything about that situation, the accommodations there? What were they like, and were they satisfactory for your purposes?
I was very surprised at the amount of cooperation that I received at that facility. It was quite impressive. The visiting room was quiet. No visitors came in or anyone. An officer sat outside the door, obviously, to observe, to make sure everything was secure. They were aware that I was coming. I had no problems checking in, and I will say this. This is a little unusual. I always ask, but I never usually get a yes. I discovered during the first evaluation session that Mr. Taylor reported to me that he had prescription lenses that had been prescribed for him in the detention facility. Being able to see accurately is important to completing IQ tests and other tests, so I asked the officer, is there any way we can get his prescription lenses from his cell? They sent an officer to get those for me, and the second day, Mr. Taylor brought them himself.
Now, the reason I ask about the accommodations, you said it was quiet. Do the accommodations have any impact upon ability to conduct an assessment?
The only thing that I would say that happened, and I forgot to mention this, this was the first time I had been to the MCC. I'm sure other people are familiar with that, but it's near the airport, and several jets either were flying close by or overhead, and sometimes it shook the building. And that startled me the first time it happened. I watched Mr. Taylor. He was completing some tests. When some of these jets went over, he appeared used to that. He didn't appear to notice it at all. And that sometimes happens when people live next to very loud things like trains. But otherwise, I think the detention facility went out of its way to provide appropriate accommodation. Now, I will say this. I wore a mask for COVID precautions, and our tests, none of them are standardized under those conditions. There's not been a lot of research on the effects of wearing a mask on psychological tests. There has been some. Occasionally, when I knew I needed, like for time test, when I knew Mr. Taylor needed to understand me clearly, I took the mask off for those tests. But we were sitting sufficiently apart that, and I would take the mask off just for those tests. But that's the only kind of anomaly in the testing circumstances, that and the jet airplanes would be.
Okay. Can those sort of external environmental issues affect testing depending upon the severity?
Yes, they can. Many other detention facilities or prisons I've been in are quite loud, even if you're in an area where it's just you and the examinee. This was not loud at all. It was perfectly quiet. It was amazing.
Now, with respect to prior to meeting Mr. Taylor for the first time, had you had the benefit of reviewing any of his records?
Yes, I'm not sure which records I obtained necessarily before interviewing him. Some of them I got afterward. I had requested a number of records, that your office obtained a number of records for me. After my first evaluation session, this often happens, the examinee tells me about places they've received treatment or gone to school or work. And so after the first evaluation session, I often have present a request for additional records. I've received, since the evaluation was complete, a Social Security disability evaluation that was done when he was age 18. That is not included in the report, obviously, because I received it afterward. But I've received some records before the evaluation, others while the evaluation was in progress, and some afterward.
Okay. And if we could talk about that initial meeting, initial interview. Could you walk us through that? We know where you were and what the environment was. Do you have a recollection and or referring to your report, your initial observation of Mr. Taylor and the progress of the assessment?
Sure. Okay, so I think other evaluators here have testified that ethically our first obligation when we meet with examinees in forensic settings, or essentially any settings, is to make sure that they understand the purpose of the evaluation and the limits to confidentiality. So like the other evaluators, I went over those issues in detail with Mr. Taylor. Things like who I was, who had retained me, the fact that nothing that he said was going to be confidential. Everything of importance would go into a report that would be shared with the prosecution, the defense, and the judge. I talked with him about that I was not performing any sort of therapy with him, so that he understood that I was only there for court purposes. And I told him that if he revealed to me anything about history of abuse, either with himself as the victim or perpetrator, that was not already in the records and been reported to authorities, that I would be required to report that. Also, if he indicated he intended to harm himself or someone else, that I would have to report that as well. And if he told me about anything that threatened the security of the institution, that I would have to report that as well. So that's kind of called a confidentiality warning or forensic warning.
And let me ask about that. As you are giving that confidentiality warning, are you observing and essentially assessing Mr. Taylor?
Yes, I am.
As to his understanding?
Absolutely. So once I go through all of that information, I first ask them, tell me what I said in your own words. I would say the majority of defendants I evaluate say very little back to me. And Mr. Taylor also said very little back to me, so I asked him specific questions about the information I had given him. And when he got anything incorrect, I re-educated him. Now, what was curious about his initial presentation when I was going through the confidentiality warning is his responses to me were extremely slow. So there was a prolonged response latency. His responses were monosyllabic, mostly one word. He indicated he understood the confidentiality aspect, but he had not He couldn't recite who had retained me, who would see the report, that kind of thing. So I provided him with further education repeatedly, and until I felt like he understood enough. I mean, I gave him several reminders and reassessed, and he was able to give me more correct answers. But still at that time, he was presenting as actually not very alert. He seemed to be having a great deal of difficulty understanding what I was saying, and he had very delayed responses. Now, that's different from his presentation later in the evaluation, but that was a notable anomaly at the beginning.
Okay. And approximately what time of the day or night did this first session begin? Actually, it began right at 9, because I got there and they made sure I started right at 9, which was my request, that first session. And before I forget, how long did that first session last?
I'd have to look at my notes. I interviewed him over 2 days for a total of 15 and a half hours. And I was with him all day, both days, so I would say, the sessions, both of them were about equal in length, a little longer than, 7.5 hours roughly for each, a little more.
Okay. And without getting too deep in the weeds about this, but was there a lunch break? And
Yes, absolutely. I make sure when I do evaluations that I speak with the officers about the need to take breaks and the need to have a lunch break, particularly because I don't want them getting hungry, because that can be distracting. They might not do their best, and sometimes they just get grumpy about that, which I do too when I don't eat. So I make that clear at the beginning that I want their lunch brought in, that I'm going to need for them to take some breaks, whenever they have to go to the restroom. And I even offer breaks at multiple times throughout the evaluation session. So,
well, after the confidentiality disclosure, did you immediately launch into testing, or what did you do with respect to evaluating Mr. Taylor?
well, one of the things that I think is very important to testing, and you'll find this in all testing manuals, it's important to establish rapport first. Now, rapport differs from a therapy client and a forensic examinee, but I spent half the day interviewing him about his background before I started any testing. And another reason, when I'm retained by the prosecution, that I think this is important, is that I realize there's going to be some mistrust and some hesitancy. There's usually less when I'm retained by the defense, but I think it's especially important when I'm retained by the prosecution to spend time establishing rapport. So I did not start testing until the afternoon, after they went and got his prescription lenses.
And during that morning period of time of establishing rapport, did he communicate with you?
He did. After maybe 45 minutes or an hour, his presentation started to change. He began to answer my questions more quickly. He was more elaborative. He was actually animated at some point, smiled, made jokes, laughed. And his presentation was entirely different by the afternoon. By late morning, I would say he was very animated. And that continued throughout the afternoon. The second session when I evaluated him, that one started about 9:30. I did not see that initial kind of responsiveness that I'd seen at the beginning of the first session. He was animated throughout that evaluation session. So yes, his presentation changed quite dramatically from about the first hour of the evaluation and began to change and then was very different.
Okay. Now, let me just ask, you used the term animated. Could you explain what you saw?
Yeah, he began to smile a lot, laugh a lot. He made a lot of jokes. He became more, he appeared very interested in talking about himself. And I thought that was great. I encouraged that. Then when I had requested that his hand restraints come off for the testing, so I didn't just test all afternoon. I tested, gave him a little break, discussed some more about his history with him, then tested again. Then when his hands were free, he gestured, as he talked and things like that. So when I would say he's been one of the more animated forensic examinees
Okay.
that I've seen.
And were his responses and his affect and demeanor appropriate for the setting?
And they were. He occasionally smiled when we were talking about serious subjects. I've seen that happen many times before. So that's what I would say was maybe a little inappropriate. There were times that when I asked a question, he answered a related question, and I would have to rephrase. That's covered in my report. In my experience, that's not unusual with people with intellectual disability, but most of his answers were quite relevant. Now, I did have to ask follow-up questions, and he was perfectly cooperative in answering follow-up questions. So those were the kind of the main things I noticed. I mean, there was nothing impaired about his gait or motor functioning. He had good eye contact. His thoughts were concrete, but they were logical. I didn't see any signs of major mental illness, like hallucinations or anything, which he also denied. He was oriented to fully. The first time I evaluated him, he gave a different date, a close date. I think he said it was like September 13th instead of the 12th. But the second time I evaluated him, he knew the date, so he was fully oriented. The first time I evaluated him, I noticed some speech hesitancies where he would start to say something and then he would stop. A lot of times that's associated with stuttering. I did not see stuttering in the first evaluation session. I saw a little bit of that in the second session, along with the speech hesitancies and then some facial expressions. So that's kind of how he presented. I could understand his speech really well. Now, let me say this. I know some people cannot. I spent 6 years in juvenile court evaluating individuals very similar to him. So it is possible that I can understand his speech patterns a little bit better than the average individual because I've had all of that experience.
And you're referring to Shelby County Juvenile Court?
Yes, Shelby County Juvenile Court.
With respect to his giving information about himself, was he forthcoming? And
he appeared to be. As I said, he seemed to like talking about himself, and that's great when you're doing an evaluation. Now, I did notice there were some discrepancies so one of the things I also noticed about him is he had some trouble with time frames, telling me the exact date or the exact age, but those discrepancies were usually small. For instance, he told me that his father was shot and killed when he was 3. The records and collateral sources indicate that happened when he was 2. So those are the kinds of discrepancies that I saw, but those did not appear to be deliberate. He did not appear to be deliberately presenting inaccurate information.
And I was going to ask about that with respect to later in gathering the information. And to your recollection, were there any major discrepancies about his recounting of his own history and family history?
There weren't any major discrepancies. I did believe there was some hesitancy to tell me about some of the issues in his home environment growing up, and where in this, I believe in the Centerstone records, where he was noted to have a black eye, and he gave a story about that at the time that didn't really sound realistic. Could have been. He did not really touch on the issue of his own history of sexual abuse or his own history of being alleged to have done that. He did tell me he was in a facility for sex offender treatment. I don't think it's unusual. It's in my experience, it's not unusual for defendants to be kind of guarded about that, because that involves them saying some things about family members and relatives that they don't want to get into. So I did think he was really pretty guarded around that, but that's typical in my experience.
And during this pre-testing period, are you essentially conducting a mental health assessment or an assessment of Mr. Taylor?
Oh, yes. I'm evaluating his mental status throughout the evaluation, throughout the entire evaluation. Even though it's presented kind of in one section in the report, I think it's clear that I'm covering both evaluation sessions. I'm also, given the records that I had, I was making sure I asked questions about things that I knew and that I had records to compare with. If there were discrepancies, I would ask him that. I did not have all the records at that time, so some of the discrepancies that I found later on, I did not question him about. But any clinical evaluation is going to involve an ongoing assessment throughout the evaluation of psychological factors, behaviors, way defendants present themselves, whether there are signs of major mental illness or signs of cognitive impairment, if there's anything that's notable, medically. Sometimes this didn't happen with Mr. Taylor, but inmates can start to tremble or something like that, if they have an accelerated heart rate. All of those things are kind of incorporated into what you're looking for throughout the evaluation.
You referenced the eyeglasses. Were there any other signs, indications, and/or records that Mr. Taylor, at the time you saw him, was taking any prescribed or non-prescribed medication?
Yes, he reported that he had been prescribed some mental health medications, but that this had occurred recently and not before, except he talked about having a history of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and he said he had taken medicine for that previously. But I did check I looked at the medication administration records that were not complete, but in terms of verifying what medications he was on, he had been placed on an antidepressant, I think. So I did not think the medication was affecting the results. In fact, if somebody's prescribed those medications, ideally they are taking them regularly when you evaluate them. His MAR reflected that he was taking the medications that were prescribed on a regular basis, and those medications should have improved his mood so that he wouldn't be depressed, distracted by depressed thoughts, that kind of thing. We got the MAR later, and so I was able to verify that he was taking. There were some instances earlier, he'd actually been taking the medications a little longer than he said. There were some instances earlier where they recorded that he did not take the medications, but he then began taking them all. And there was some confusion in the records because his medicines had been changed at one point, and the prescribing practitioner had told him he needed to take his evening medications with a meal, or with a snack. And there were indications in the record that at least a couple of times he was not given that snack, and he advised the prison nurse that he was supposed to get that snack. And I don't think he took the medications on those nights. That situation appeared to be rectified after he made 2 requests to get his snack. That appeared to be rectified because after that he was taking both morning and evening doses of medication.
And the reason I ask that, of course, is can medication affect validity of testing?
It can, and so can non-medication or being prescribed a medication that you're not taking. But some of the kind of the earlier antipsychotics could have a severely sedating effect, and there could be a problem with testing under those conditions. But the medications he was prescribed for depression, again, you want those individuals taking those medications because ideally they're going to correct some mood issues, maybe some distractibility issues, and I was able to confirm that he was taking them. So if he had not been on them, I would have been more concerned if he'd been prescribed them and was not taking them.
Okay. So in essence, did you see anything in that regard that would affect his ability to take the test?
Not
or
negatively
to assess?
impact. No, there was no. I did not see any negative impact.
Okay. And at the time of the initial interview and testing, were you aware that he had some history of illegal substance use?
I was.
Okay. And being in the correctional facility, was there any indication that he had recently had
So,
access to?
I poured through those records last night, and he was. So I got his disciplinary record from the detention facility. I think it was complete, but I don't know. Many of the records that I got were incomplete from various agencies. Actually, there was one instance when he was charged with possession of a substance or paraphernalia. Now, my recollection, and that was in June of 24. I didn't have a chance to get all the way through the records, but my recollection is that he had paraphernalia in his cell. They didn't find any substances, but I mean, paraphernalia is certainly an indication that there was some substance use. However, I did get disciplinary records from some of the previous detentions, and that was the only disciplinary infraction that I saw out of all of them that pertained to possession of substances or paraphernalia.
Okay. And the reason I ask that is, did he appear to you on September 12th, 2024, to be under the influence of any?
You know, when he initially presented, his initial presentation could have had many different etiologies or causes. So certainly that was one thing I was considering at first. But afterward, as I said, when his presentation changed, there didn't appear to be, he did not appear to be intoxicated. And during the second evaluation session, I wasn't concerned about his presentation at all. But in that initial time frame, when he was presenting with very slow responses, monosyllabic responses, appeared, not to understand a fair amount of what I was saying, you would try to, there are, like I said, many things that could cause that. So at first I was considering that. Now later on, I think I narrowed down what the etiology might be of that, and I didn't think it was due to substances.
Now, pursuant to the request for intellectual functioning or testing for intellectual functioning, how did you go about doing that?
Well, I administered the mini mental status examination, the second edition. I administered the two different forms of that. There are two different equivalent forms of that. I administered one of those at the beginning of testing on the first day, which would have been early in the afternoon. I administered the equivalent version close to the beginning of the second session. Of course, I have to go over the confidentiality issues again, of course, at the beginning of the second session. And I spend again some time verifying background that I hope I remembered correctly from the first session. I verify that with him, and then again as a kind of a rapport building thing. The mini mental status exam, second edition, is essentially a formal, normed, and standardized mental status exam. It looks at things like orientation, language, writing, memory, and a brief screen of visual spatial skills. And so the two forms are equivalent. So that was the first thing I administered as a screening measure.
Yes, is that a written?
No. Well, parts of it are written. The parts that are written is he has to. You ask him to write a sentence, any sentence, and then the other part that requires writing is you ask him to copy a diagram, and so that's where you get a sense of visual spatial skills, but it's a brief screening. So those are the things that involve writing. There were a couple of things that involved reading in addition.
And the reason I asked that is you referred to having his handcuffs removed.
Right.
And what sort of time period was the mini mental state examination?
That takes maybe 15, 20 minutes, maybe 30. But I usually, a lot of times I will give that first, not only to assess mental status, but to kind of ease into cognitive testing, because that's kind of brief, not real demanding. He didn't perform equivalent to what I would say was an average. I talked about in my report, he presented as somewhat impaired on those, but it is kind of it's lower demand than a full IQ test. So that's why I kind of ease into cognitive testing with that.
Okay, does that sort of give you an initial assessment of his abilities?
That's correct.
Okay. And speaking of abilities, did he appear to be giving effort?
He did. I would say that he was fully cooperative with everything I asked him to do. There were some testing results that suggested that his effort fluctuated a little bit. But I think I indicated in my report that could have been due to fatigue. It could have been due to distractibility. He had a history of ADHD, that has clearly, the symptoms have clearly improved with age, which is not uncommon. So I didn't observe any distractibility. In fact, I said when the jets went over, he kept on working. He didn't appear to be distracted by that at all. But I did see some inconsistent effort, and if the distractibility was there, it was more minor. It wasn't observable. He appeared to fully cooperate with all testing. And one of the things I will note is that, and I guess we can talk about his IQ score in a minute, but let me explain something. The Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale 4th edition, which is the comprehensive, normed, and standardized IQ test that I gave him, each subtest has a series of instructions, and there are you do some different procedures if the individual does not answer the first couple of items correctly. And so you have to move to those different procedures and subtests. That never happened with him, which a lot of times when I evaluate people with equivalent overall ability, they don't get both of the items correct that they have to, and that's in several subtests. Now, he dropped off quickly after getting those initial items correct, but what was notable to me was that I'd never had to repeat the test instructions to him at all. So I gave him the test instructions. Sometimes you can repeat. He never asked for repetition. He appeared to understand all the test instructions when I gave them the first time. And he got all of those initial items right on the subtest, so I never had to follow the other procedure that we do, which, as I said, is a little unusual in my experience, because I have tested a number of people with intellectual disability. That a couple of things that stood out about that is, I think as I said, when I interviewed him, sometimes he answered a related question. That wasn't frequent, but it was notable, which is not unusual for people with intellectual disability. But there appeared to be no difficulty with understanding the test instructions, and I sometimes, with people of equivalent ability, have had difficulty with that. There was none of that. So he was cooperative with all testing procedures. He asked everything. I mean, he answered and responded to every test item that he could. So, as I said, he appeared fully cooperative with testing.
And how long did it take to administer the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, with Mr. Taylor?
About an hour and a half, I think. And the testing time was not unusual.
And that's what I was going to ask. Is there any sort of time limit where pressure to have it completed within a certain period of time?
On some subtests, there is. Yes. Not the verbal ones, but I think we've heard testimony here about verbal and performance IQs. Performance are more looking at visual, spatial, motor kinds of things. Well, there is one verbal test that there is some time pressure. Not limits, but there's some time pressure. But yes, some of the subtests are timed, some of them are not.
Okay. Now, let me just ask for the sake of the record, were you essentially scoring these in real time?
Okay. I attempt to score in real time, and I do pretty much do that. I do not rely on that scoring. I go back and double or triple check all of my scoring. So I am scoring in real time, but I don't rely on that as, I don't just turn in, I don't just finalize, I double check those scores.
Prior to doing the report?
Yes, prior to.
And were there any other tests given that day? By that day, I mean September the 12th, 2024.
Yes, I gave him the, an achievement test, the wide range achievement test, 5th edition, the green form of that. That's composed of several different subtests that measure essentially reading and math abilities, also spelling. I also gave him the word memory test, which is a memory test with some built-in scales of what we call response style or effort. Those are the tests that I gave on that day.
Okay. And would that be the RAISE memorization of items, or was that given the 26th?
That was given the 26th.
And how about the test of memory malingering?
I'm sorry, I gave that one also on the 12th, the test of memory malingering.
Could you explain what that is designed to do?
Okay. Okay, so one of the things that was realized long ago by psychologists is that sometimes people would not give their best effort deliberately on psychological tests. And I would say some people are better at telling that or not, but it was deemed to be a significant problem among psychologists that psychologists began to design tests of, they're sometimes called response style, tests of effort, sometimes they're called tests of malingering. There are different ones of those, and the TOM is, it is one of those tests. It's not the only test of response style that I gave, but I did give that one the first day, and his scores were within. I would say among our validity tests that are available, it's one of the more simple ones, maybe easier to feign on. But his scores were in the normal range on that. They didn't show any impairment, any problems with his memory. I mean, it's tested sort of memory. So, he did fine. He had no problem with that test.
Okay. And with it being within normal range, did that allow you to go and do more testing?
I did. I'm pretty sure I gave the achievement test after I gave the TOM. And then on the second day that I met with him, I gave some additional tests of response style, and I gave a couple of sleep questionnaires. If you would like for me to go into, or later.
Yes, I was going to say, but first, were these tests primarily for intellectual functioning, or did they also bleed over into adaptive functioning assessment as well?
Those were all tests to determine whether he was giving sufficient effort on the cognitive testing, or whether he was not giving sufficient effort or deliberately attempting to present himself as more cognitively impaired than he was. There was no sign on the TOM that he was either giving poor effort or trying to malinger cognitive impairment.
But as far as the intellectual assessment of what those tests are designed to give you information about, the WAIS and the achievement test?
They're supposed to give me an idea of whether I can trust the validity of my scores on cognitive testing. And My understanding of best practices in forensic evaluation is that when an examinee might have some secondary gain or motivation to present themselves incorrectly in cognitive testing, that you do test for response style. Some researchers have recommended that you have multiple tests of response style that are given throughout your evaluation session. So that's what I typically do for an extended evaluation session. So I gave him additional tests of that, more sophisticated tests on, well, the Green's word memory. I gave that day as well. And then I gave him some additional tests of response style the second day that I met with him, because I have seen individuals' motivation change from the first session to the second. That has happened. There can be intervening events. They can talk to other inmates who tell them to present differently. They can talk to their lawyer. So that's why I've seen recommendations to give tests of response style in every evaluation session.
And in interviewing and evaluating persons charged with criminal offenses, does that come into play as a concern?
It's absolutely a concern when you conduct a forensic evaluation.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about the Green's word memory test that you administered that day.
Okay. Let me say one thing first.
Yeah.
When I was trained at Alabama, I was trained that the tendency to maybe misrepresent your cognitive functioning was not necessarily unusual. It was kind of seen as a strategy of dealing with the psychological evaluation. So while we don't want individuals to malinger, it is seen with some frequency in a criminal population, and I'm not sure that all of us in this room would present accurately on cognitive testing if we were involved in a criminal situation. I just don't know that. So I don't want to have a judgment on that. But the Green's word memory test is a pretty sophisticated test of malingering. And let me say a little bit about that test. But I want to make this clear about testing in general. We give tests in a forensic setting that were not normed or standardized on forensic patients. For instance, IQ tests, not normed and standardized in a forensic setting. But after a test is published and you have the normative and standardization data, that's all from the company that publishes that. So obviously psychological researchers want to re-give that test and make sure that what they've gotten from the publication, from the publishing company, is accurate. And researchers begin to administer those tests in different settings and with different populations. So Green's word memory test is unique in that it is an ongoing, it is being given, it has been for years, to many different populations. And what's unique about that is the researcher collects other researchers' results, and they are figured into the computer program that scores the results. And so with Green's word memory test, I was able to compare, even though this wasn't part of the norms and standardization, I was able to compare Mr. Taylor's results to two groups of people who were intellectually disabled who had been administered the test. One group was adults, one group was children. So what's unique about word memory test is that those additional populations are added as time goes by, and the scoring program is improved by virtue of that. And what's nice is that if you have someone who exhibits, let's say, traumatic brain, or has a traumatic brain injury, you can compare their results on the word memory test to population with traumatic brain injury. And in this case, there were a couple studies that involved intellectually disabled people, and I was able to compare his scores to theirs.
And what was your
Well, my
conclusion?
findings with
Findings.
those, yes, was that, okay, the adults, okay, the brain word memory test is a number of memory subtests. The adults only got, in that sample, only got a portion of the test, because there are some people who just administer a portion for pass-fail, and the author does not recommend that in the manual. But there was a population of intellectually impaired children where the average IQ was 56 or 55, and I was able to compare his scores to both of those groups. They are in a graph that was given to the defense experts. We normally trade data. And you're able to pick out which groups you want to compare your individual scores to, so that you're comparing to similar people. He got several scores that were significantly lower, particularly when compared with children who had IQ scores about 56, which was unusual. Another thing that was unusual about his results is that and this is just like, and it's a memory test, so one of the things you do in a memory test is you present increasingly difficult tests of memory. And he scored better on some of the more difficult tests than he did the earlier tests, which is his results were inconsistent with the expected gradient of scores. So that was unusual.
And can that be attributed to anything?
It can be attributed to different things. Let me say that those results, none of my testing of response style or effort showed that he was trying to deliberately give me the wrong answers. None of my results showed that. There's different definitions of what malingering is, but the one that I tend to use is where you deliberately are trying to give the wrong answer. None of my validity testing showed that. It did show some fluctuations in effort over time, with him performing quite well on one of the easier malingering tests. There has been research comparing the word memory test and the TOM head-to-head. The word memory test has been shown to be more sensitive to problems with effort or feigning than the TOM is. The others that I gave, I'm not aware of any comparisons. There's no, although I consider the validity indicator profile to be a more sophisticated test than the TOM, there's no research that I'm aware of comparing the VIP to the TOM. I consulted with the author of the VIP several years ago when it was given in another case, and he was not aware of any testing, but one of the reasons that I give simple tests of response style and more complex is that the more complex ones can give you more idea about whether your scores might be affected by fluctuating effort, poor effort, answering test items irrelevantly, like randomly, or deliberately suppressing response style. So in the test that was done head-to-head with the TOM and the word memory test, it was shown that the word memory test could pick up more subtle or nuanced response styles than the Tom alone.
And you went back a few days later.
Right. I went back in 14 days later, and I gave more testing at that point. I didn't give any more cognitive testing, but I gave more tests of response style, and I gave some questionnaires about sleep problems because of information he had given me in the first session and the differences in how he presented initially and later. Because of those, I gave him some the Berlin Sleep Questionnaire and the Epworth Sleepiness Scale during the second evaluation session, and I gathered more background information, had him talk more about himself, verified information I had obtained in the first session.
Okay. Now, just the Berlin Sleep Questionnaire and the Epworth Sleepiness Scale, what are those designed to reveal?
They're designed to assess sleep apnea. Now, sleep apnea is a condition that I'm sure everybody's familiar with it, but I'll just reiterate, that's where people have pauses in their breathing at night. Their blood oxygen levels can go down as a result of that. Sleep apnea is associated with many, many medical problems. Heart disease is one of them. He reported to me in the first session that he had been told by one of his girlfriends and by cellmates that he stopped breathing at night when he was sleeping. Now, I asked him if they said that he snored, and he said no. So I gave him the Berlin Sleep Questionnaire, which is designed to assess obstructive sleep apnea. Obstructive sleep apnea is where you have a physical blockage of your airway due to a relaxing of some of the muscles in the throat area. Central sleep apnea is where the brain fails. It sends signals to the brain to breathe that are inconsistent while you're sleeping. So those are different. I mean, they're both sleep apnea. People who have both kinds of sleep apnea can snore, but some people with central sleep apnea do not snore. And so he reported he'd never been given feedback about snoring, but he had been given feedback in more than one setting that he stopped breathing at night. So I gave him the Berlin Sleep Questionnaire, which is designed to assess obstructive sleep apnea. It was pretty clear from that, although I could not score the entire thing, because one place I have to know his BMI, and I had conflicting information from him and the records about how tall he was and how much he weighed. So I couldn't fully score that one, but I did establish on the snoring factor he did not snore. I gave him the Epworth Sleepiness Scale because that's a scale that measures daytime sleepiness and your reported difficulty with staying awake in certain situations. The Epworth is different from the Berlin in that people with central sleep apnea would tend to have high score. With sleep apnea that was central, would tend to have high scores on the Epworth, as would people with obstructive sleep apnea. But when you compare the two, he reported presenting with an excessive amount of daytime sleepiness. And so that's what that's designed to assess. The Berlin looks at obstructive sleep apnea specifically, and he did not, a lot of that snoring. So the reason that I assess that is that can affect how people present to you. People can have a lot of trouble, particularly staying awake in the morning. if they've got sleep apnea. But then they also often have trouble throughout the day. So when I got those scores on the sleep questionnaires, particularly the Epworth, he had a very high score indicating that he needs a medical evaluation for sleep apnea. And then I asked him about his coffee intake, which one of the things you'll find with people with sleep apnea is that they'll ingest stimulants of any kind that they can get. Hopefully in a detention setting, coffee is the only one they can get, and he reported drinking as many as 8 cups of coffee a day. He reported that people give him feedback when he has had no coffee, that he's just not right. And he reported that when I saw him the first evaluation session, he'd had no coffee before he met with me. But he had his coffee before the second evaluation session. So one of my concerns is that his initial presentation that at the beginning of the first evaluation session may be related to sleep apnea. So I do think he needs a medical evaluation for that. But yeah, I mean, it was a dramatic difference in presentation. So, and that's why I tried to figure out what was going on with him presenting so differently at first. And so that's why I gave the sleep questionnaires.
Okay. And is that also to assess, correct me if I'm wrong, validity of the other testing, or to see what effect that might have on results of the other testing?
Well, so one of the things that when he presented that way initially, I knew I needed to give some time to that to see if he kind of remained in that state. Because, yes, I think if I'd started with cognitive testing, I would have seen a bigger problem than I saw. If I'd started with testing at the beginning of that first session. And so I do think that sleep apnea has been a problem for him. I don't know how many years, but yes, with that condition untreated, it can affect how people present significantly, particularly in the morning, and it can affect the results of psychological testing, particularly cognitive testing, if they're not alert and if they're drowsy. I mean, so.
And I want to just sort of step aside while we're on that to ask about, did you have the benefit of the records that the doctors yesterday talked about from the assessment at 10 years of age, 15?
I did.
Okay.
I did.
Okay. And to your knowledge, were any of those from historically given what any outside stressors that could be known or circumstances that those tests were given in vis-a-vis sleep apnea?
You know, I did not see anywhere in the records that he had been evaluated for sleep apnea, and that's why I have a recommendation in my report for that. Because I don't know. First of all, I don't know when that sleep apnea started. I don't know if it started in childhood. He thought it started after he got shot as an adult. I'm not a medical doctor. I don't know how that would happen. But so I don't know when the sleep apnea started. Let me make clear about that. But I would say his presentation, when I saw him, as I said, I thought it would have been significantly impacted by his original presentation. But I could not find anywhere where he had been assessed for that. I don't know that, I didn't see where he'd ever reported that to anyone before me. But I think there are a number of, in terms of impacts on psychological testing and the results of the IQ tests that were given before mine, I think there are a number of factors that could have impacted those results. that made those IQ scores difficult to compare to mine, let me say. I think there are a number of things that were different. I don't know if you want me to go into those now.
Well, I was going to wait
Okay,
towards
that's
the
fine. That's
end
fine.
for that, if that's all right.
Okay.
So, but just briefly, could on the 26th, additional testing, and let me just ask, when you went back to see him on the 26th, was it the same interview room? And
Yes, absolutely, same conditions. I don't know if it was the same officer observing, but all the conditions were still the same. And again, I wore a mask throughout.
and went through the confidentiality.
Absolutely, at the beginning. And this time, he had retained more than he did initially after I first presented in the first session. But I did have to provide him with some reminders, not as many, and it went more quickly before I got some correct answers to my questions. But absolutely, ethically, I went through the entire confidentiality. First, I asked him about things he might remember, but then I went over all the issues again with him.
Okay. And was that in common everyday language?
Yes, and make sure that it's in common everyday language, because I want them to understand the confidentiality limits. So I present things in non-technical language. So for instance, when I talked about, so I knew I was going to assess his intellectual functioning, so I said, I'm going to talk to you about how you think, how you reason, write, read. I'm going to look at that. And then when I talk about adaptive functioning, I talk about, and then I'm going to look at how you handle your day-to-day business, how you take care of yourself, how you take care of others around you, jobs, things like that. So I try not to use very professional terms because people just don't understand them. Many normal people wouldn't understand those if they're outside the field of psychology. So yes, the confidentiality warning is given in non-professional, non-technical language.
Okay, so the additional testing on the 26th.
Okay, so the additional testing on the 26th,
She's given a lot of that, hasn't she?
On the 12th.
Right.
So
We're
were
just
there
getting
any
to the
additional-
26th. That's what she talked several times about what she did the second day.
I was going to say, on the second, were there any additional that you haven't referenced yet?
I gave several other effort tests
Okay.
on the second day, and the sleep questionnaires.
The sleepers, okay, thank you. Now, go to the IQ part in a minute, but adaptive functioning. What was your assessment tools and information about learning of his adaptive functioning?
Okay, so I did not, so let me tell you what I did. First of all,
Yes, sir.
I'm kind of a bottom line kind of guy, and I know you want to
I
set a
know.
record, but
Okay.
are you saying he's intellectually disabled?
yes.
Yes.
Okay. And are you saying he needs to be committed?
I didn't evaluate for commitment. I wasn't asked to evaluate that. And in the forensic world, our ethical guidelines indicate that we should not try to answer a question that we were not asked if we don't evaluate for that. So I didn't
Are you
evaluate.
saying he's competent or not?
And I didn't evaluate that either. What I was asked to do was do an evaluation of his intellectual functioning. Number one, I think to verify that see if he was continuing to function in the range of intellectual disability. Because I think it's been talked about that sometimes people can, if their IQs are around 70, their adaptive functioning can improve as they get older and they would no longer qualify as intellectually disabled. So I think number one was me to verify whether he still had the condition. And then I think two, to look at comparability of my scores that I obtained with earlier scores. But
Okay, well, I will then we'll go quickly through. You just answered a question that was going to ask about adaptive functioning. Is that always equivalent to an IQ score?
No, not at all.
And why is that?
Well, the two are considered to be independent constructs. For instance, when you assess adaptive functioning, if you, all of us have adaptive strengths and weaknesses. Some people can have adaptive weaknesses, have normal intelligence, but have pretty impaired adaptive functioning in certain things. So they used to be considered to be related constructs, but the definition of ID keeps evolving, and so they are considered to be independent constructs, related, but more independent than they used to be, which is why, according to the DSM-5 TR and the 5, you need to assess intellectual functioning, adaptive functioning, and emergence in the
Okay.
development.
And does adaptive functioning evolve or change over time?
It can.
Okay.
It can, yes.
Would a person, hypothetically at age 15, adaptive functioning versus someone 29 or 30 years old always be the same?
No, but sometimes it could be the same between
Okay.
both those ages, but it can change.
Would that depend upon environmental factors,
Experience.
life experiences?
You know, people exposed to very enriched environments often have improvements, significant improvements in adaptive functioning. Yes.
How about people who are exposed to the opposite end of the spectrum, the streets, gangs?
Well, there's a fair amount of research to suggest that exposure to things that are now known as adverse childhood experiences can impact mental health of individuals and physical health of individuals. In that seminal study, it was, I believe, in 1988. There's also been some subsequent research on something called, so adverse childhood experiences, the abbreviation is ACEs. It's been an additional study that looked at, and these are all traumas, potential traumas that occur in childhood in the household. There's subsequent research that was conducted in Philadelphia on an urban population, very similar to Mr. Taylor, the living environment. 5 additional potential traumas were then added. But one of the things we know about trauma, childhood and ongoing, is that it can significantly affect physical and mental functioning, can affect learning, capacities to learn as well.
But as far as adapting, do people adapt to their environment,
Yes, absolutely.
be it a good environment or a bad environment?
And an example of that would be when people are, let's say young people are caught with carrying weapons and they should not carry weapons. And they should not, it's against the law. But some of them live in environments where everyone around them has a weapon. And there's plenty of shootings and plenty of violence. And they carry weapons to protect themselves. That's an adaptive strategy in that environment. Now, it's against the law, but different environments require different adaptive skills. That is true.
And has Mr. Taylor exhibited adaptive skills from within his environment?
Well, he did, and but let me say the adaptive skills. When you're measuring adaptive skills, according to the diagnostic manual, you need to consider the person's adaptive skills in comparison with age-matched peers, gender matching, and sociocultural environment. People who grew up in similar environments as them. And that's sometimes difficult to do with people who live in typically poverty-stricken, gang-infested, violence-infested environments. So that's sometimes difficult to do with just our instruments that we have now.
All right. Now, to cut to the chase was what I said was going to get to after that. But what were the results of your testing and assessment of Mr. Taylor's IQ?
So his IQ, full-scale IQ was 70. That's within the range of mild mental retardation. But I note that it's somewhat higher than scores that have been obtained in the past. But the score that I obtained was within the range of mild intellectual disability.
Okay. And with respect to, other than the questions that I've already asked, is there a definitive answer to why your testing achieved that result as opposed to some of the others that we heard about yesterday?
First let me say there is a standard error of measurement around that score of 70. So his true IQ with the chances are 95 out of 100 that his true IQ falls between 67 and 75. I do think there are some things that could potentially have impacted earlier scores when comparing them with mine. It is absolutely true that people's IQ can be quite variable. There have been studies that have shown that. When he was tested as a younger individual, so his first IQ testing was at age 10. I have heard it said that it was age 9, but the testing occurred in October of 2004, and he was born in August of 1994, so it was when he was 10. He was living in a very chaotic environment. His family was moving frequently. He'd lived in shelters. When he had homes, they were crowded. He was exposed to domestic violence. He was sexually abused. And there are some independent records indicating that. He was perhaps physically abused. He lived in dangerous neighborhoods. His household was noisy. He didn't get, and that is clear in the DCS records, that he reported that his household was noisy, and he was observed to be very drowsy one morning. He said he'd been kept awake all night. He lived in poverty. Sometimes he didn't have food to eat. Their utilities were cut off. They were evicted from residences. They lived in homes that were in disrepair. One of them, the mother was concerned about mildew in the home and that affecting her children. And that house was subsequently condemned. So when he underwent this testing when he was age 10, which was the comprehensive WISC and then the unit, I would say that he was in the middle of a lot of chaos. That's the environment that he grew up in. So I think there were some differences in terms of those scores that were obtained earlier. Another thing I would say is that I don't know when his vision problems began. I went through the school records. They were incomplete, but I did have some indications of his vision. There were some anomalies, like one of the reports gave a date that his vision and hearing were tested with no results. But I did see testing at the age of 13 where his vision and hearing were found to be in the normal range. He had a problem with earwax buildup, and he reports continuing problems with his hearing. He reported that when I saw him. I didn't see any overt signs of that, but sometimes people with earwax have chronic buildup and it can affect their hearing. So I think hearing could have been an issue, vision could have been an issue. I'm unsure about residual effects from substance use. I know he was tested at age 15 by Dr. Brown. I think she testified that she thought his marijuana use occurred after she tested him. I had a Centerstone record that said at age 12 he was smoking marijuana. He told me he started smoking at age 13, 14. So that's a potential problem. The sleep apnea, again, I don't know when that started. I don't know what testing that might have affected. I don't know what time of day he was tested. He was diagnosed with ADHD as a child. I would not say that his treatment for that condition was at all consistent. In fact, I talked to his mother about that, and she said she often only gave him 1 of 2 doses a day, and not when he was not in school. Now that's, okay. So, and then obviously I gave some effort testing when I don't think that's been given before. So all of those things I think could have made the IQ score that I got not comparable with the other ones.
And with respect to your findings, did you see anything that would prevent Mr. Taylor being competent under the Dusky standard?
I can't speak to that. I didn't
Okay.
ask him about competency at all. Yeah, not at all. I didn't address that. I didn't attempt to address that. I mean, as an example, when you assess competency to stand trial, one of the things I think has been talked about, you ask them for their version of the events to see if they can explain that to the attorney. I didn't bring up his current offense at all.
I was going to ask you, there is nothing in your report whatsoever that references the facts of what he's charged with, correct?
Exactly. I didn't discuss those
So
with
is
him.
that a decision for the judge?
Right, absolutely.
All right. And I would tender her counsel has this copy of her report as the next numbered exhibit.
Okay. 19.
No further questions at this time.
Questions on behalf of Mr. Taylor?
Dr. Johnson, you testified that your previous experience includes evaluating those who, for commitment, civil commitment, I guess.
Yes.
Okay.
When I worked in 2 different places, when I worked at Memphis Mental Health Institute, we had a forensic unit there where people were referred to a hospital setting. I assessed for committability due to mental illness. And then I assessed for committability when I worked as an intellectual disability specialist. I also assessed for that in juvenile court. It's quite rare to have a juvenile commitment, but I assessed for that there, and we did have one while I was 6 years.
So it's fair to say that out of those, multiple committal evaluations that you did, some people you found were not committable.
That's true.
Okay, and to your knowledge, have any of those that you found not committable, to your knowledge, did they ever pick up any subsequent offenses or anything after you found them not non-committable? That you know of, to your knowledge.
Yeah, I don't usually follow cases. I mean, I don't have a dog in the fight. I don't often know what the decisions are about the cases that I evaluate, particularly in juvenile court. So I would wager that some of them did, but I don't know. Except in the federal system, sometimes I was aware of that, but.
Okay. I already had some questions typed for you, but I also had some that I drafted while you were testifying on direct, so I may jump around, but just have some patience for me. I want to talk about your effort testing on Mr. Taylor.
Okay.
You testified and you put in your report that your testing, your cognitive testing, you felt was impacted by how Mr. Taylor performed on the validity testing or effort testing.
What that suggested, because his effort appeared to be inconsistent, that what I might have gotten was an underestimate of scores. I would predict that would be not large variations in the scores that I obtained, but that, yes.
Okay. And then you testified about, his IQ score, him scoring a 70, but that kind of being like a floor, not a ceiling, essentially, with the indication that his score could really be anywhere between a 67 and a 75, right?
Yes, that's what the confidence interval is for that score.
Okay. And is this confidence indicator, is it in conjunction with validity testing?
So the confidence interval around a score would not change by virtue of validity. I mean, yeah, it would not, that wouldn't change the confidence interval around the score. Now, the results of validity testing would not change the confidence interval around the score.
Okay. Okay, so the IQ test was standard. It gave you a score. Sounds like an estimate to me.
All IQ scores are estimates because a person's true IQ can never be known.
Okay.
It's a theoretical construct, and every test you give is an estimate of what that true score is.
Okay, all right. And so, based on the statement you made about his performance on the cognitive testing after administering the validity test, and this is kind of like just an opinion of yours that, hey, I think this could be lower. I think that his abilities may have been underestimated because of the validity testing.
May have been. And
May
that's,
have been.
That's what I
Not for
phrased
certain.
in my report, yes.
Not for certain, ma'am.
Right, there's no.
Okay. As it relates to, you've already spoke about Mr. Taylor being cooperative,
Yes.
correct? And you said that he was putting forth adequate effort to your, during your observations,
He
right?
appeared to be, yes.
Now, is it standard for you to just administer validity tests on everyone in which you perform a cognitive test?
No, it's not. It's not standard. Well, let me say this. In a forensic setting where there's secondary gain to present yourself inaccurately, I typically give effort testing. Now, let me say this. If I'm testing an examinee and they're presenting to me on cognitive tests equivalent to what my records show, and they appear to be fully cooperative, then it doesn't look like they're trying to present themselves differently. So let me say this. If they know I'm testing for intellectual disability, and they know that can affect the outcome of their case, usually I administer effort testing in those situations. when I tested juveniles, for instance, many juveniles try to present themselves as better than they are. I think not as many in Shelby County as in some other more in Shelby County than in some other places. And we had juveniles tell us that other juveniles in detention had told them to look stupid on our testing. So when I got indications of that, or that I felt like, what I was seeing was not equivalent to records, or I had occasion to doubt the records and how good they were, then I would give effort testing. And I would do that whether I were retained by the prosecution or the defense.
Okay, so when you said secondary gain, based on your experience, this is, like you said, when someone is facing criminal charges, and also you said you've done some work with pending Social Security benefits applications, right?
Yes.
Would you also administer validity testing with those?
We did not, because we were not paid to do that at that time. I don't remember giving validity testing, and I don't know why we would not be paid for that, because it seems like that would be an obvious situation where someone might present themselves differently. But what we were given was, we were told essentially, you will do cognitive testing or you'll do emotional testing.
Were you
And
specifically asked in this case to perform validity testing on Mr. Taylor?
Did who?
In this case, were you paid by the state, or were you asked by the state to perform validity testing on Mr. Taylor?
No, I was not asked by the state to do that.
Okay. Now, kind of still sticking on validity testing, you said that while working with juveniles that they would tell you about other people telling them to look, I don't know, for lack of words, slow or stupid or whatever.
The words they used were stupid.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you made your own decision based on review of prior records and basically I don't know how much weight you put on those records. At that point, you decided, okay, whether I should go forward with the validity test or not.
Right, and how they were presenting, and I will tell you that if somebody came in and said, they told me to look stupid when I came in here, they always said, I'm not going to do that. Those people usually did fine. But no, I didn't give validity testing to every juvenile. Absolutely, I did not.
So, given what you said about prior record review, or review of prior records, you received records from, again, school records showing IQ testing. You received records from when Dr. Brown evaluated him in 2010. You had records from Dr. Mathai. You saw records from, multiple records from Dr. Wood. You saw these things. You saw records from Dr. Ipe. That wasn't enough to show you that, hey, maybe validity testing isn't required here. None of these other people have tested him, and this has been happening over the course of his life.
No, that wasn't enough.
That wasn't enough.
I was asked to do an independent assessment. I reviewed all that. Now, not all of those records, like, I don't want to mispronounce her name, Dr. Ikpe, I think, I-K-P-E. The only records I saw from her were a committability certificate, a certificate for committability, and some notes she had written. So those weren't, I've reviewed them, but those weren't relevant to my evaluation of an IQ score. So not all the records I got, I reviewed for relevance, but I didn't rely on all the records that I received.
Okay. So why weren't those records relevant enough to kind of check the box on, oh, we don't need validity testing here? What was wrong with the prior records?
Well, I'm not saying anything was wrong about them, but I think you just heard me testify to issues that may have been relevant to prior testing that might have been underestimates of his functioning. But I'm not saying that any of those other evaluations were insufficient. I might have done things differently, but I'm not saying those evaluations were insufficient.
Right. Doctor, I have a question. Are you, let me grab this. Are you familiar with or do you know of the article titled "The Relationship of IQ to Effort Test Performance"? Are you familiar with that article written by Andy Dean?
No.
Okay. I'm going to pass you up a copy of this, and we can talk about it.
If this is about, I think I may know what it's about without reading it.
It's about reports and studies that have been done to show that validity testing should not be done on individuals with intellectual disabilities.
And I don't agree with that, and that's not a consensus in the field.
Right. You referenced speaking with the author of, or the person that created the validity indicator profile.
I did.
And you talked to this person about the purpose for that specific test, correct?
Right.
Now, did you know there have been many reports and studies done to show that the validity indicator profile at least has a 95% false positive rate? Meaning that people who are tested who has an intellectual disability and the VIP effort test is administered on them, that the results 95% of the time will show that they're not putting forth effort when in actuality they are.
And I didn't, my conclusion was not that he was not putting forth effort. There are 4 classifications on the VIP, and let me say this, I heard some testimony that the VIP is not indicated for people with intellectual disability. The person who testified to that, Dr. Wood, she and I were both mental health experts in a prior case where she diagnosed somebody with intellectual disability and gave him the VIP.
Okay.
So, and I did not say he was deliberately trying, I want to make that very clear. I hope I am. I'm not saying he malingered cognitive deficits when he didn't have them. I'm not saying that he deliberately tried to present himself as more impaired than he is. The findings were of inconsistent effort, which could have a variety of etiologies, as I said, fatigue, distractibility, just, or, he could have just decided, this item's too hard, I'm not even going to try it. But my point was that there could be a variety of etiologies for that finding, and I hope no one misunderstands me to say that he was deliberately trying to present himself as being more cognitively impaired than he was. That is not what I said.
Understanding, but you use these results, you use these validity results to write an opinion and said the results of testing may underestimate Mr. Taylor's cognitive functioning. Given the below described results of performance validity testing that suggested full effort was not sustained throughout testing. So basically you're saying an underestimate, meaning that he could perform higher.
I said they may underestimate. I
Okay.
didn't say that they did. I chose my words very carefully
Why
there.
didn't you say overestimate then? Why specifically underestimate? Meaning
Because-
that he could be performing well above what he put in the test.
Well above is not within, I do not think he could perform well above what he did at all.
Well above the.
I said slight underestimate, and I said may underestimate his scores.
Okay.
I hope I'm very clear about that. I chose my words carefully in my report.
Give me 1 second, Dr. Johnson. One second, please. Those are all the questions that I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Use of that witness.
Judge, as a technical matter, we will be showing some video for this witness. All of the exhibits are going to be placed on the same thumb drive. Mr. Wing's in agreement to that, and I've also spoken to the clerk about it already.
Okay.
Am I correct that the computer on the right is the one that can drag to the screen? Yes. Just making sure it hadn't changed.
Do you know where he is?
I know that he is here.
Turn that on, make sure they can get their items up they want. she have to go to 4, or does she have a cell phone?
He has a cell phone, but I think she went just to make sure. But I'm sorry, Judge, I'm in here, so I don't have any additional information.
Usually they have them waiting outside.
Yes. I'm not sure what our miscommunication was.
Do you swear to tell the truth, so help you God?
Detective Joe, could you please state your full name for the record?
Yes, it's Jeffrey Jobe, J-O-B-E,
And could you please spell your last name for the court reporter?
J-O-B-E.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Detective Joe, where are you currently assigned at the Metro Nashville Police Department?
The homicide unit.
And how long have you been in the homicide unit?
Since September of 2023.
And what was your position before that?
I was a precinct detective in Central and then a precinct detective in Hermitage.
And how long have you been with the police department?
It'd be 23 years in less than a month.
And were you assigned as the lead detective to investigate the homicide of Jillian Ludwig?
I was.
And can you describe what was your response to that homicide investigation specifically?
So I was a lead detective in the case. It occurred towards the end of my shift that day, and I was notified by my sergeant, Sergeant Andrew Petrati of the homicide. Upon notification, I responded to the crime scene and received a briefing. Following the briefing, I did a walkthrough of the crime scene, and then we began a canvass of the area for witnesses and additional evidence.
And can you describe the crime scene?
Yeah, so the victim was found in the Edge Hill Community Park, which is at the corner of Deaford Bailey and 13th Court. Inside the park, there was a pooling of blood and some vomit where the victim had fallen. Separating the park from Deaford Bailey, there's a metal fence that had various strike marks on it, apparently from bullets. Going farther down on 13th Avenue Court, we found 6 .40 caliber spent shell casings several hundred yards away from where the victim was, or about 100 yards.
And that area where the casings were found, you said there were 6 of them, correct?
That's correct.
And they were .40 caliber.
Yes.
What is in that area where those were found?
So in that area where those were found, there was a trailer parked off to the side on the court. These particular casings were found near the 1356 to 1370 14th Avenue South. If you're facing Deaford Bailey towards the park, there's a basketball court to the left, and then ultimately there was the suspect's apartment at 1346 14th Avenue South, which was just about a row back from where the casings were found.
And is that known as Edge Hill?
Yes, Edge Hill.
And can you describe, was a suspect developed during that investigation?
Yeah, so this particular incident, because it happened in the daytime, there was good video surveillance from Edge Hill cameras. And we partner with our Titans team. They usually come out to the scene and assist us in the investigation. And during the course of that, after reviewing the video surveillance, we had developed Shaquille Taylor as a suspect.
And was Detective Gibbs, was he one of the Titans detectives that you partnered with?
He was.
And was he already familiar with Mr. Taylor?
He was.
And, Your Honor, at this time, we have clips of the surveillance video that our media analysts have, I guess, color-coded some of the items in it just to make it a little bit clearer about what's being shown. And I would ask to submit that as the next numbered exhibit, but also display it to this witness.
Okay.
Yeah, so this street in the background, that's 13th Court. That's where we found the cartridge casings. In the foreground is the basketball court that I discussed. And then you can see the trailer on 13th Court. That's around the area where we found the cartridge casings. And then about 2 rows back is where the suspect apartment was at 1346. To the left, if you keep going down 13th Court, you'll run into Deaford Bailey. And then beyond that is the Edgehill Community Park.
And just for the record, there's a key to the left of the screen that has Shaquille Taylor's name with red, Jillian Ludwig with yellow, car is green, driver is blue, and passenger is orange. And those persons or items are circled when they appear in this video. Detective Jeb, were you able to identify the person that is shown in the orange circle right now that's on the basketball court?
No, ma'am.
And you described a trailer. Can you see that trailer in this video?
You can. It's through the trees, parked right here on 13th Court in front of the 2 vehicles.
And that vehicle that has the green circle around it, can you describe why was that important?
So that was the car that Mr. Taylor was shooting at that resulted in the death of Jillian Ludwig. This car pulls around on 13th Court and then parks near this trailer. And then you'll see somebody get out of the car. They walk over towards the basketball court. And then he interacts with another individual. And then those 2 people get in the car and the car drives off. And you can see here in blue, that's the person that got out of the car. And he'll stop over here by the basketball courts. These 2 men will have an interaction before they get into the car.
And that's the passenger and the driver, correct?
Correct. That we haven't positively identified as of yet.
And Detective Joe, just for the record, can you describe what's being shown now?
Yeah, the 2 men are over here at the basketball courts.
Detective Joe, I apologize. I was referring to there was a bug on the screen.
Oh, yeah, there was a wasp on the screen that temporarily blocked the view.
Thank you.
And you see the 2 men walking back over to the vehicle, the blue sedan.
And can you describe what is shown now?
Yeah, so Shaquille Taylor will be circled in the red. You'll see him. He'll actually run up towards the car, firing the pistol multiple times. And there he is, sprinting up 13th Court.
And is that area right there the area where the casings were found?
It is.
And that's right there by that trailer, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. And here you can see Shaquille Taylor walking away from the scene.
And the direction that Mr. Taylor's walking, do you know, is that the direction of the apartment he was living in?
That's roughly the direction that 1346 14th Avenue South is.
And if you could describe what's happening now.
So now he's turned around and he's walking back towards the court, near the basketball courts.
I'm going to play the second video file in this exhibit, which I believe is 16. Detective Joe, can you describe what's shown here?
Sure. So this is just a separate angle from of 13th Court. So Deaford Bailey would be kind of over here where the key is, and then you're facing down 13th Court. Here you'll see the blue sedan. It's coming down 13th Court, and it'll park over here in front of the trailer where the casings were found. You can see the driver get out. He walks towards the basketball courts. You see the other individual walking off the court towards the driver. They have an interaction there. And now they're walking back to the blue sedan. At this point, they're both going to get into the sedan. One in the driver's seat, one in the front passenger. And the car is going to pull away from the trailer towards Deaford Bailey. It's going to make her right onto Deaford Bailey. And as it pulls off, you can see Shaquille Taylor up here in the right corner in the yellow shirt. Run towards the car, firing multiple rounds. And then he walks away from the scene. There he's continuing down 13th Court towards the area of his apartment. And following the incident, he continues to walk around the area.
I am gonna go to the third video clip.
Okay. So again, this is just from a different angle. It's close to that second angle that we just saw. This is the car making the right-hand turn from 13th Court on the Deaford Bailey. In the yellow, that's Jillian Ludwig. As you can see, she just fell. And then there were strike marks on this fence that separates the park from Edgehill.
Detective Job, I'm going to stop this third video clip and play the fourth one.
Okay.
Can you describe what's shown here?
So this is a different angle. This is on 13th court, facing towards Deaford Bailey in the park. You can see the basketball court here on the left. The green circle shows the blue sedan arriving and parking in front of the trailer that's there on 13th court. It'll back into the space. Then you'll see the driver get out and walk down 13th court. Now you see the person circled in orange. He's going to walk over to where the driver is, where they have their interaction. And they walk back to the blue sedan with one getting in the driver's seat, one getting in the front passenger. You can see Jillian Ludwig circled in yellow in the park. The vehicle pulls off towards Deaford Bailey. And then you see Shaquille Taylor running down 13th court, firing his weapon at the car. Mr. Taylor comes into frame down here. He's wearing the yellow shirt, the black pants, the red shoes that we ended up getting out of 1346 14th Avenue South with the search warrant. I also used a picture of him walking across the camera to identify him during his interview.
Detective Job, you said that there was a search warrant that was done at 1346 13th Avenue, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you said those specific clothes, the yellow shirt, the black pants, and the red shoes were all located?
Yes.
And whose residence was that?
Kenitra Hills, his girlfriend's.
And were there any other items located?
We recovered 2 cell phones, 3 9mm magazines, and a couple of .22 caliber bullets.
So 9mm magazines, correct?
Correct.
And then 22 ammunition.
Correct.
Did you locate a .40 caliber firearm?
We did not.
And was Mr. Taylor located in that residence?
Yes, so once we determined that he was probably in that location, we set up a perimeter around it, and he voluntarily walked out while we were setting up that perimeter.
And after, I guess, was he taken into custody at that time?
He was.
So you had already obtained an arrest warrant, is that correct?
No, not at that time. I think he had an outstanding warrant at that time, so we could take him into custody for that. But we did have him positively identified at that point as the shooter.
And did you take him in for an interview specifically?
I did. He was transported to headquarters at 600 Murfreesboro Pike, where I interviewed him with Detective Jason Smith.
And was that interview audio and video recorded?
It was.
And Ms. Barkley, can you clarify, I think I announced that this was exhibit 16, but it's actually 18?
The thumb drive
Yes.
is 20.
20, okay. So this will be the surveillance video clips 11/7/23 from the thumb drive. And Your Honor, at this time I would ask to play the interview of Mr. Shaquille Taylor. And I would also ask that that recording be entered as the next number exhibit, which would be 21.
It's on a different thumb drive?
It will be on the same thumb drive.
Okay, when you leave it 20, how long is it?
It is approximately 40 minutes. There is 5 minutes of this interview that is done by another detective who's testifying today, so I will only be playing 35 minutes of it.
But you're wanting to play all of it?
Correct.
Do you want to play it now? What do the parties want to do? Take a break, play it now, then take a break, whatever, I'm here all day, whatever you want to do.
No, I think at some point this gets to our Stacy concerns. I mean, I don't know.
To your
About concerns
relevancy?
about- Yeah.
You carry her on the
Judge,
road.
it's extremely relevant. Mr. Taylor, when he's interviewed by Detective Joe, was able to lie to him about the circumstances and attempt to set up a self-defense claim. His interview is incredibly relevant. He also lies about which cell phone is his in an attempt to deceive the police, so the police never actually obtain his real cell phone.
All right, I'll overrule the objection, but you just want to play it in open court rather than just for the court.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. So what is your preference? You want to play it now or and then break, or break now and then play it?
Do you want to play it? Yeah,
Go
I'm
ahead.
in agreement to play
Okay.
it.
Mr. Taylor step back and we'll figure out our difficulties. We'll be back at 12:45.
Course in recess.